All right, so we'll say good evening. Let us begin. We are picking up at the Mishnah on the bottom of Chaf on the base 20b at the Mishnah. We saw we ended off with beautiful Agarata last night, just about Kadosh Baruch Hu's beautiful favoritism of Klal Yisrael. And now we begin a new Mishnah. Baal Keri Maharher Belibo. So both say, so remember, we actually just learned this in Daf Yomi as well, right? About one of the takanas of Ezra. It's incredible, always beautiful when like Daf Yomi, Amud Yomi intersect and overlap. So the Mishnah says as follows: A Baal Keri, so a man who had a seminal emission, Maharher Belibo ve'ino mevarich lo lefanav lo la'acharav. Ultimately, again, he's Maharher Belibo. Maharher Belibo means he is not allowed to go ahead and say Kriyas Shema. Right? He's not allowed to say Kriyas Shema. Rather, ultimately, again, he goes ahead and he thinks Shema. Maharher Belibo here literally means thought. So he cogitates, right? In other words, he thinks the words of Shema in his mind, but he does not articulate them. Now, remember again, this is based on the takana of Ezra, that Ezra said that if a man has a seminal emission, he is not permitted to speak words of Torah until he goes to the mikvah. So that's the kind of Ezra. So Baal Keri Maharher Belibo, ve'inu mevarich lo lefanav v'lo la'achareha. And ultimately, again, he does not make the Berachos Kriyas Shema before Shema or after Shema. That's the halacha. Okay. V'ala mazon mevarich la'acharav ve'inu mevarich lefanav. And for benching, he recites benching after he eats, right? But he does not go to make a bracha before he eats. Now what's the logic in that? So remember again, here's what's interesting to note, is that ultimately again, benching is doraisa. So we're going to see anything that's a doraisa, the Baal Keri is going to do, although we'll talk about Kriyas Shema in just a bit, right? So ultimately again, the Baal Keri doesn't make brachos before he eats, because brachos before you eat are dirabanan, but he will recite benching after he eats because that is a chiyuv doraisa. Rabbi Huda says, Mevarich lifnei mulacharem. Rabbi Huda says, no, the Baal Keri goes ahead and makes brachas before and after. Now we'll have to see before and after what he's referring to. We'll see in the Gemara. So we'll say, let's first analyze this first piece. Remember again, when the Mishnah introduces us to this concept, the first thing the Mishnah tells us is that halacha l'maisa, a Baal Keri, when it comes time for Shema, goes ahead, doesn't say the words, rather what does he do? He thinks the words. Maharher Belibo, he cogitates. He actively thinks about the words of Shema. So we'll say, it says the Gemara, Am Rabina, Zos Omeres. What do you see from this? What do you learn from this? This teaches us, Hirhor Kedibur Dami. What this teaches us is that ultimately, again, thought is the equivalent of speech. Hirhor Kedibur Dami. Now we'll say, now why would you say that? Kedibur Dami. Because if thought was not the equivalent of speech, Lama Maharher, then why even bother to cogitate on the words of Shema? Right? Think about it for just a moment. Right? If thought was not like speech, then what exactly are you accomplishing by thinking about Shema? It's nice. Always okay. I guess it's always good to have positive thoughts. But lamaisa, if the actual hirhor is not like speech, then what are you accomplishing vis-a-vis Shema? So rather, it must be elamai hirhor kedibur dami. So it must be that thought is just like speech. But what's the problem? If thought is the same thing as speech, then what? Yotzi bisvasav. Then say it. As I say, if thought is the same thing as speech, then you might as well just actually say the words of Shema instead of just cogitating and thinking on them. To which the Gemara says, you're right. This halacha of Kriyas Shema is modeled after what our ancestors did by Har Sinai. What happened in Har Sinai? If you look at Rashi says over here, Kida'ash kichan b'Sinai, she'frishan mi'isha dechsiv al tikshu al isha, ve'aprisha zu samach azol atakin tvila lebal karyon, kodim shia asku b'Torah. So Rabbi says, it's actually very interesting. Where did Ezra come up with this idea that after a man has a seminal emission, he can't learn Torah until he goes to the mikvah? Like I understand what Ezra was trying to accomplish, right? The Gemara says, what was he trying to accomplish? He was trying to get people, I will say the true Kiddusha, true holiness, is when a person sanctifies themselves even with that which is permitted. Even with that which is permitted. So what does that mean? Something could be mutter, something could be permitted. It doesn't mean necessarily that you should partake of it all the time, right? The paradigmatic example of this is, you could eat meat and you could drink wine three meals a day. There is nothing halachically prohibited about that. I mean, it might not be good for your cholesterol, but you're allowed to do it. So, but we know that if a person does that, what happens? What happens? It creates a sense of gluttony, right? If that's what you're doing every meal 3 times a day, but is it asur? It's not asur. It's not asur. So clearly, like what was motivating Ezra was the notion that, so in a marriage, of course, intimacy is permitted, not only permitted, but encouraged, a pivotal part, an important part of the relationship. But even within a marriage, a person has to be careful not to go ahead and essentially engage in just constant self-indulgent, we'll call it intimately gluttonous behavior. So that's where Ezra's coming from. That's the logic. So if a man knows, he's permitted to be with his wife, but if he knows that ultimately you got to go to the mikvah before you come to Daf Yomi, right? You got to go to the mikvah before you learn Torah. Got to learn before you do that. So what it just does is it puts a person in a different headspace. Now, again, why we don't observe this takana today, different discussion. The Hasidim, actually, this is the reason why the Hasidim go to the mikvah every single day. It stems ultimately, again, from Takanas Ezra. So why we don't do it as a whole other discussion, not for now. But where does Ezra, so I understand the svara, but where does Ezra get it from? So interestingly enough, it comes really from Har Sinai. What happened by Har Sinai? The halacha was that husbands and wives had to physically separate, not live apart, but like intimately separate, for 3 days prior to Matan Torah. So Ezra said, you see this idea that for Sinaitic revelation, so man had to be pure from seminal emission. That was the idea. So Ezra took that concept and kind of created a takana, created an enactment around it. That's the idea. So therefore, I will say, interestingly enough, so according to this first approach, Ezra said like this, that halacha l'maisa, if a man had a seminal emission, he can't say Shema until he goes to the mikvah. That's the halacha, right? But what can he do? He could think Shema. Why? Because hirhur is kedibur dami. Because thought ultimately, again, is the equivalent of speech. But if thought is the equivalent of speech, then what? Then just say Shema. No, because in that respect, he's modeling this whole takana after Har Sinai. Okay, interesting. So the Gemara goes back to the Gemara says, Rav Chisda says, hirhur lav kedibur dami. Rav Chisda disagrees. Rav Chisda holds, actually that's not true. He holds that thought is not like speech. Because if you would think that thought is like speech, yotzi b'svasav, then just say it. If thought is the equivalent of speech, that means thinking it and saying it are the same thing. If that's the case, then just say it. Elamai, here lav kedibur dami. So you have to say thought is not like speech. But if thought is not like speech, then what are you accomplishing? Thinking Shema. So the Gemara says, so lama maharher, Amr Elazar, this is incredible. Kadesh shelo yehei kala olam oskin bo v'yoshevu batal. But say, what are we concerned about? Listen to this. So Rav Chisda said like this. If we would just say that when a man has a seminal emission, essentially he doesn't do anything. Right? In other words, don't think Shema, don't say Shema until you go to the mikvah. What's going to be the problem? He might be sitting in the base medrash. Everyone else is going to be saying Shema. And what? He's doing nothing. You can't do that. You can't have that. You can't. It's actually such a profound idea. You can't have a situation where the community is actively engaged in some type of dynamic spiritual activity, and you're sitting on the side. You can't have a situation like that. So therefore, again, that's why the Mishnah says, okay, so I can't say Shema because I need to go to the mikvah, but everybody else is saying Shema. I'm not going to sit there counting ceiling tiles. I'll think Shema. Now, is thought the equivalent of speech according to this approach? No. So therefore, I'm not discharging an obligation, but at least I'm somehow involving myself in the spiritual activity of the collective. I would say such a beautiful idea that when you see whatever you want to call it, your kehila, your community, your family, your friend group, people are actively engaged in something positive, you can't be the odd man out, right? You have to figure out a way to be part of that dynamic. Incredible. So the Gemara goes right to the Gemara says, the Negros of Pirkach, but why not go ahead and just learn something else? In other words, so fine. So we don't want a person to be sitting there doing nothing while everyone else is saying Shema. So let him learn something else. Why does it have to be Shema? No. It's tafka. if the tzibur, if the congregation is involved in Shema, it almost looks inappropriate for me not to be involved in that. So therefore, even though I can't say Shema, because ultimately I haven't gone to the mikvah, but halacha l'maisa, at least I can think Shema. Even though thinking it is not the equivalent of speech, but at least like this, I'm involved with the kehillah. So it's also a very it's also a very beautiful idea if you think about it. It's also saying that the famous statement of Voltaire that the perfect is the enemy of the good. In other words, sometimes in life, especially in spirituality, we have this concept. We have this concept of like we aim for perfection, and we sometimes erroneously think that like if it can't be great or like close to perfect, it's not worth it. And that's so not true, because first of all, nothing in life is perfect, right? Nothing in life usually comes like a 10 out of a 10. And if you always aim for it, I mean, you see this, people, right? It happens all the time, like people want to take things on in life. I hear this all the time. People say, I only take on things that I know I could be successful in, right? Or I only take on something that I know I could bring to completion. I'm always thinking to myself, like, people like that must have a lot of free time. Because the truth is, how many things can you actually guarantee that you're going to bring it to the finish line? Right? How many things can you guarantee perfection? And it's so beautiful, because what is the Gemara saying over here? So we'll call the guy Ruvain, right? So Ruvain had a seminal mission. He hasn't gotten to the mikvah. He's in shul. They're saying Shema. So now, okay, Ruvain, you can't say it. You go to the mikvah, you can't say it. But, so think it. But come on. Thinking is not speech. Thinking is not speech. Right? You're right, thinking is not speech. But you know what? It's something. It's something. And something is always better than nothing. It's true in almost every area in life. Certainly true in spirituality as well. Something is always better than nothing. Top of Chavalav. Excuse me. 21a. V'hari tefillah. The davar shatzibur oskin bo. So what about davening? What about Shmona Esrei? So now watch this. So now what about if a guy's a Baal Keri? And the tzibur is davening Shmona Esrei. So watch this. We learn about Shmona Esrei. Tanan. Haya omed b'tefillah v'nizkar shul Baal Keri. Listen to this. A guy is davening Shmona Esrei, and in the middle of Shmona Esrei, he remembers that he had a seminal emission, or not then, right? In other words, he remembers the night before that he was intimate with his wife, right? So l'maisa, and he didn't go to the mikvah. So what do you do? What do you do in a case like this? So the Gemara says, Lo yafsik el yikatzer. Don't stop Shmona Esrei. Rather, what should you do? Just kind of be, Mekatzer means daven a shortened Shmona Esrei. So we'll discuss, we're actually going to devote a lot of time to that concept about a shortened Shmona Esrei. But the idea is don't stop, don't just stop in the middle, but kind of, say it in a truncated form for the rest of the way. Now, here's what's interesting. Taima da aschel. Now, the reason you only say a truncated conclusion to Shmona Esrei is because you already began it. Ha lo aschil. What happens again if a man knows that he had a seminal emission and didn't yet begin Shmona Esrei? So what's the halacha? Lo yaschil. You shouldn't start. So what do you see from here? What do you see from here is that halacha l'maisa, if a man has a seminal emission, even though the tzibur is doing something, we don't allow him to participate, even though they're all going to be engaged in dynamic spiritual activity, in this case the Shmona Esrei, and he's going to be sitting there standing there doing nothing. To which the Gemara says it's different. Shiny tefillah to lespe malchus shamayim. Shmona Esrei is different. Shmona Esrei is different than Shema. We'll say Shema is unique because Shema is the acceptance of the yoke of heaven. That's a dramatic thing, and that's so dramatic that you can't have it be. You can't have it be that everyone is saying Shema and one guy isn't doing anything. Shmona Esrei, okay, Shmona Esrei, as important as it is, and beautiful as it is, and holy as it is, it's not the acceptance of the yoke of heaven. And therefore, again, by Shmona Esrei, if Ruvain knows that he's a Baal Keri, then ultimately, again, he won't daven Shmona Esrei. I have Hari Berachos Hamazon li'acharav delesvei malchus shamayim. What about benching? Right, so benching doesn't have acceptance of the yoke of heaven. Utzinan, we learned ala mazon mevarich le'acharav ve'eno mevarich lefanav. So we'll say, yeah, by benching, what's the halacha? We say that a Baal Keri says benching. A Baal Keri says benching. So I don't understand. Why is a Baal Keri saying benching? To which the Gemara says, Ela kriyashma ubirchas hamazon daraisa utfila derabbanan. Okay, here it is. I will say. It's a much simpler distinction. That, remember again, I will say, this whole concept that a Baal Keri cannot engage in davening or Torah before going to the mikvah. What's the source of that enactment? What's the source? Right? So it is a rabbinic enactment modeled after Har Sinai, but it's rabbinic. In general, rabbinic law only has the ability to impact other rabbinic law, doesn't usually have the ability to impact biblical law. So therefore, again, Ezra, you can make your takana, and that's fine. So your takana ultimately, again, will prevent you from doing other rabbinic things. So for example, if you're a Balkari, didn't go to the mikvah, you don't daven Shmona Esrei. Why? Shmona Esrei is d'Rabbanan. What won't Ezra's takana impact? Mitzvahs d'oraisa. So Shema, there's a biblical obligation. Benching, especially if you're full, there's a biblical obligation. So whenever you have a biblical obligation, the takana of Ezra, which is a rabbinic enactment, will not go ahead and trump your biblical obligations. So therefore, halacha, so what comes out is if a man had a seminal emission, didn't go to the mikvah, he wouldn't daven Shmona Esrei, but he would daven Shema, ultimately again, and he would recite Berachos Hamazon benching, because both those are daraisa. Like I said, contemporary a little bit different today, because we don't really this, the Mishnah Berurah brings down, he actually says that what we do today for Takanas Ezra, he says is Tisha Kabin, a shower. That if a man has a seminal emission, he should at least try to go at Tisha Kabin. You pour, Kabin is an amount. You pour 9 Kabin. I think the post can bring down that it's like the equivalent of like a 6-minute shower. Something that amount of. Well, I guess it depends on your water pressure. Your water. So what is it? 7 minutes. Sorry, 7-minute shower. Guess it depends also on your water pressure or whatever else, right? But that ultimately goes ahead and counts as Tisha Kabin, which could technically speaking go ahead and take care of that particular obligation. Okay, a lot more to say on that halachically, but we'll leave this for now. Good. Let's go right. So here we go. Now we mentioned benching. We get into some really great gemaras over here. So Amar Rav Yehuda, Minayin leberachas hamazon darais lachareha min haTorah. We'll say, from where do we know that after you eat, you bench? That's all. Where do I know it from? All right, go ahead and where do I know the concept of benching? Shneimar v'achalta v'savata uverachta. It's one of these beautiful gemaras. What does Rabbi say? It's just the pasuk, right? V'achalta v'savata uverachta. You will eat, you will be satiated, and you will bless Hashem. That's the concept of Berachos Hamazon. Minayin leberachas haTorah lefanah. Shabbos said also, by the way, that also tells me that when does benching take place? Benching takes place after you eat. How do you know it takes place after you eat? Because the progression. V'achalta, you'll eat. V'savata, you'll be satiated. Uverachta, and then you will bless. So from here you see two things. Number one, the concept of benching. And number two, the concept that benching takes place after you eat. Good. So say, how do you know? This is interesting. Berachos haTorah. Right? Every single morning we recite Berachos haTorah. How do you know that Berachos haTorah is recited before you learn? Where do you get that from? Beautiful pasuk. Shneimar ki shem Hashem ekra havu golda le'elokeinu. Moshe Rabbeinu says, when I call out the name of Hashem, right? Havu golda, give greatness to our God. So this idea over here is that essentially, Kishem Hashem Ekra, when you call out the name of God, when do you call out the name of God? Every single time a person learns Torah, they are effectively calling out the name of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. So when Moshe says, when I call out the name of God, or essentially, before I call out the name of God, Havu Golda Le'Elokeinu, ascribe greatness to HaKadosh Baruch Hu. What's that greatness? That's Berachos haTorah. That's Berachos haTorah. We'll say a really beautiful, just like a straightforward Gemara. I'll just read one more line, then we'll stop for tonight. Amar Rav Yochanan, Lamanu Berachos haTorah lachareha min Berachos Hamazon mikal v'chomer, or Berachos Hamazon lefaneha min Berachos haTorah mikal v'chomer. So Rav Yochanan essentially says, you learn each of these out based on a kal v'chomer. Now, what's that kal v'chomer? Right? We know what a kal v'chomer is. What's the kal v'chomer? Here we go. Berachos haTorah lachareh mi Berachos Hamazon kal v'chomer. We learn out Berachos haTorah. Berachos haTorah. Ultimately, again, that you should even say Berachos haTorah afterwards from Berachos Hamazon mi kal v'chomer. Ma mazon she'ein ta'on lefanav ta'on la'acharav. So food where there's no biblical obligation to make a bracha before you eat. There is a biblical obligation to make a bracha after you eat. Torah, Torah, which does require a bracha before you learn it, should what? Certainly require a bracha after you learn it. Okay. or birchas hamazon lefanei min birchas haTorah mikal v'chomer, and you can learn out the obligation to bench even before you eat from a kal v'chomer from birchas Torah. What's the kal v'chomer? Uma Torah shein tuna lachareha tuna lefanei. So Torah which only requires the bracha before you learn it, but doesn't require bracha after you learn it. Mazon shu ton la'acharav eno din shei ton lefanav. Then food, which already does require a bracha afterwards, certainly should require a bracha beforehand as well. To which the Gemara says this whole kal v'chomer doesn't work. Why? Ikal mifrach malamazon shekein ne'aneh umalator shekein chaye olam. We'll say so beautiful. You can't really compare the two. Food and Torah are two different things, right? Food, ultimately, there's physical benefit, and Torah is eternal. Torah is eternal. So you can't really compare the two. Furthermore, Furthermore, the Mishnah explicitly says that there is only a biblical obligation to make a bracha after you eat, but no biblical obligation to make a bracha before you eat to yufta. So therefore, we'll say what comes out is that halacha l'maisa mida oraisa. We recite birchas haTorah before we learn. We recite birchas hamazon, benching after we eat. But we will see that there is a rabbinic concept of a bracha, rishona bracha, before we go out and eat. We'll say shkoyach. All right, everyone's invited to join us for Chasidus. Yes, Hashem. In the base medrash.